Welcome to Carving the Bible. My name is Francisco, and on this channel, I'm carving the Bible verse by verse into granite. And as I do that, I research and I reflect on the verses I'm working on. And in this video, I want to touch on an issue that was brought up in a comment to one of my earlier videos on the story of Hagar in Genesis. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, here's a quick recap. Sarai, Abram's wife, is barren. She cannot conceive. And so Abram doesn't have an heir. So Abram and Sarai come up with a plan where Abram will impregnate Sarai's Egyptian slave Hagar and get an heir from her. Now, let me just say that this is not uncommon in the ancient Near East among the landowners and the wealthier classes who had slaves. If their wife could not bear a child or they had no heir, they would have an heir through the slave, and that child would be raised as the heir of the landowner. So that's what's happening here. So Abram has sex with Hagar and impregnates her, and she becomes pregnant. Now, what this does is it causes a jealousy and a rift between the two women, because children and pregnancy were considered a blessing from God. And so that means that Hagar was getting a blessing and Sarai was not, and this created tension between the two of them. Now, Abram doesn't want to get involved in this catfight, so he tells Sarai, well, do whatever you want. And Sarai abuses Hagar, and Hagar runs away into the desert. Now, in the desert, Hagar meets God, where she calls him El Roi, the God who sees me. Now, it's a very interesting term and rather unique, because this is the only place in the whole Bible where that title is used for God. So if you haven't seen my video on it, I'll put a link in the description below. But then God tells her to go back to the household where she was mistreated, basically to go back into slavery. And as the story progresses, she gives birth to a son, Ishmael, who becomes the heir apparent until Isaac comes along. And then we find out that all that drama, it doesn't really mean very much, because Ishmael will not be heir to the covenant and will be replaced by Isaac. So this is what that comment was concerned with. Just looking at the internal logic of the story, what's the point of putting Hagar through all that pain? She gets sexually used. By our standards, she gets raped because she didn't have any choice in the matter. She had no agency. She gets pregnant. She gets abused by Sarai. She runs away. She then gets sent back by God to the people who abused her. She carries a child to term, and then a few years later, he gets replaced. So is Hagar's encounter with God in the desert just a feel-good story, but ultimately meaningless? Is that title that she uses, the God who sees me, El Roi, just a throwaway line? I mean, why would the God who truly sees her send her back into servitude? That's the question. So I looked into that tension in the text and what it tells us about the world in which these stories were written. And let me just say that I'm not a Bible scholar. I do some research and I think about these stories as I carve the Bible in granite, but my priority is making the tablets, not becoming a Bible scholar. So I just share what I learn along with my reflections in these videos. So here's the first thing. Part of the inconsistency in the story seems to come from assuming that the people who wrote Genesis believed that God was all-knowing and powerful and stood outside of time in the way that later Judaism and Christianity describe him. But in the earliest parts of Genesis, God doesn't behave like an all-knowing, timeless being. God asks questions. Where's your brother? He discovers things. He regrets decisions. Think about the story of the flood. He comes down to see whether something is true. Think of the story of Babel. In Genesis, God is a presence who responds to what is happening in the world. Now that matters because it means that the originators of these traditions did not imagine God as someone who knew the future and already planned for Isaac to be born, and was just playing games with Hagar. Many biblical scholars see two different traditions coming together in these stories. The Ishmael tradition, which is older and connected to the desert and nomadic life, and the Isaac tradition, which comes later connected to land, the temple, and the people of Judah. Now, in the Ishmael tradition, Ishmael is the firstborn. He receives the divine promise. His people become a great nation. Genesis 16:10. And the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your seed exceedingly, that is not to be numbered for multitude. Basically, he's saying there's going to be so many that can't be counted. And he's saying this to Hagar, the Egyptian slave woman. But it sounds very close to what he has been telling Abram all along. And this story takes place in the wilderness. Just consider where Hagar met God, not in a temple, but in the desert. Now, in the Isaac tradition, Isaac is a miracle child. He's born to a man who's 100 and a woman who's 90 years old. But the covenant runs through Sarah, and the land of Canaan is central. The theology is tied to the settled, agriculturally focused urban life of the Judeans. So how does this relate to Hagar and her role? God sending Hagar back into slavery makes sense only when you understand the merging of these traditions. In the Ishmael stories, Ishmael needs to stay connected to Abram's household long enough to receive status, blessing, and legitimacy. Hagar's return to Abram's household and the servitude that requires is a way of explaining that connection. But in the later Isaac stories, Ishmael cannot inherit the covenant. Isaac has to be the chosen heir. Now, having God send Hagar back after she runs away accomplishes both narrative goals. It keeps Ishmael tied to Abraham, but keeps the main promise, the covenant, tied to Isaac. I think it's so interesting that the books of the Bible kept multiple origin stories, and that early biblical theology did not provide just one easy perspective. The Bible story isn't trying to hide the complexity and the tension between the traditions. It's not trying to smooth over the story's contradictions. The editors instead kept the tension. In some ways, this explanation solves nothing and leaves us feeling unsatisfied. As in the story, God is still sending an abused slave back to her masters. But I think it helps us understand better a really confusing contradiction in the way that God is acting in the story. So thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please consider watching some others or subscribing. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.